Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Tony Robles. Welcome to the People's Poet Podcast, also known as Triple P. Today, we have a very, very special guest. Want to let you know that we're coming straight at you from Western North Carolina, Hendersonville, North Carolina, to be exact. Please leave a comment. Most importantly, please like this page because we're trying to get the word out. We interview a lot of interesting people in the world of art. We've had people from the world of politics. So we're trying to expand and get the word out. So please be sure to hit the like button and do leave a comment because we do like to hear from you. We have a novelist today, very, very special guest. She is a writer who has written 3 wonderful novels. The first of which is When the Rainbow Goddess Wept. Another one is called Magdalena, and the other one is called The Newspaper Widow. I think The Newspaper Widow, that is a wonderful title. Cecilia Brainard, welcome to Triple P. How you doing today?
Hi, Tony. I'm fine. Thank you. Hope you're doing well.
Oh, I'm doing fine. You know, on your blog recently, you were taking submissions from Filipino writers in the diaspora about how they were dealing with COVID-19.
Yeah.
And, talk a little bit about that because, it's really had an impact on our day-to-day living and, talk about how it's impacting writers in particular and even and inspiring writers to create.
First, let me mention a little bit about my little project there about getting people to talk about their COVID experience, or what I called coping with COVID. I had read Daniel Defoe's the journals about the plague in London in 1600s, and I saw how actually historically how useful it was to sort of know how people lived at that time. And when this COVID broke out, I was thinking to myself that there is a place somewhere in the future where sometimes somebody will be interested in knowing how we're coping, what we're doing day to day. And so I just went about and contacted, put it out that I wanted some people to share the way they're living right now. And so it was very interesting. And since I am a writer, I had a lot of responses from writers. Also, writers like to write,
Yes.
So it was very easy to
Mm-hmm.
get, but they're not all writers. I had a social worker niece in Germany, for instance. She's Filipino, she's German American. I had some relatives, again, a nephew and a niece over in New Zealand, and they also wrote, and some classmates and so on and so forth. But to me, it was and the theme, of course, is these are Filipinos in whatever part of the world. And so there were, it was interesting to compare what the leadership in those places were doing to help with the pandemic. And so it's nothing like what's happening over here. I mean, they wore masks and they, practiced social distancing. And I recall my niece in Germany said that when she was with a client, every 45 minutes, she would open the window. That was mandatory for ventilation. And this was back in May. So they were quite aware then about the business that it is transmissible by air, by mouth, So it was very fine. Now, interestingly, writers, and I had some painters, artists in there too, since they tend to work at home and tend to be solitary, I did not have the sense that their lives had really totally changed. I mean, a lot of them are still carrying on and writing, and the angst, if you will, would be from people who had grandchildren, for instance, who could not see them because of the danger, and people had extended families who were careful not to have them over for a holiday, for instance. So it was stuff like that. But otherwise, I think that people were writing and painting or doing whatever they were doing. among my writer artist friends.
Well, which is interesting because, part of the reason to do that is so that we don't forget. Memory plays such a
Yes,
big part of what we do as writers. We had Grace Toulouse on as a guest a few weeks ago, along also with Betty Ann
yes,
Carino,
yes,
and
yes.
memory figures very, very heavily in their work, particularly in their relationships to their fathers. Can you talk about yours? Because I know that that was
Ah,
part of what facilitated your foray or your life or your
the
entrance
writing.
into fiction.
Yes. So my father was a civil engineer, um, and he died when I was 9. But he was the kind of man while he was alive who every Friday, and this was in Cebu in the Philippines, every Friday he'd bring all the kids, there were 4 of us, and take us to Alamar's bookstore. And in Alamar's bookstore, we could get anything we wanted. And I was addicted to all the Nancy Drew series and all those comics. I read comics, so we just got whatever reading material we wanted. This was pre television, I'm somewhat old. But I have to show you, Tony, my little sketch about my father taking us to
Oh,
Almar's.
oh, wonderful. Can
Yeah,
you can
so
you
this
ra- can you
was,
can you raise that a little bit higher? A little bit lower, a little bit lower. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, so that's Alimar's bookstore, and that's you
bookstore.
with your father, and I guess walking into a world of possibilities.
Yes. Now, this isn't really he, and this isn't really me, because the fact of it was he had rheumatism and he needed a cane. But in any case, this was my rendition of my childhood and what all that meant to be reading books and falling in love with it. I mean, even comics, I don't put comics down because I fell in love with print and paper and all of this, the notion of story.
Yeah.
And so I think that was, and my father was also a very calm person, unlike my mother. And so that was very important to me. Now, when he died when I was 9, then you can imagine the change in our lives, because here was my hysterical 47-year-old mother with 4 children, and she was just at her wits' end as to what to do with us. And it turned out all right. She was a very good businesswoman, and we all turned out okay. But this, so my father was his engineer, and I guess because I looked up to him, I had it in my head that I also wanted to be an engineer one day.
Right, right.
So I actually pursued it. I actually did, Tony. I
Yeah.
actually did 1 quarter at the University of the Philippines and backed out. That math test, it was just, we had 3 math classes
Oh
in
boy.
1 semester. I
Yeah.
almost went, whoa. So, yeah. So, I mean, you know how life can kind of lead you and tell you, you don't belong there. This is what you should be doing. So then my mother brought me back to my all girls college because I wanted out of the university. It was too big. I did not like civil engineering.
Right,
And
right.
so I was back in Marinol College, and I just kind of went over what major I should take, and I picked the easiest, what I thought would be the easiest. And it was easy for me because I knew I could do it. It was communication arts. It was things like journalism. It was things like script writing. It was this kind of thing that I'm sort of doing. So that to me was easy, and that really was the universe's way of telling me that's what you should be doing.
Well, it's
So
very interesting that you're mentioning, these books like Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and that type
yeah,
of thing. Um, uh, Walter Mosley spoke about that, how people say to him, well, you must have read Albert Camus and Dostoevsky. He says, when really the books that made you become a writer were, Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. He said that for him, comic books were so profound, uh, like the Fantastic Four, and they'd say, well, Fantastic Four, that's not literature. Well, it was to him. He says it was to me when I was 6 years old. It was telling him what
Yeah.
what life was about. Can you talk about now? Talk about a little bit more about your entrance into fiction. Now, there is a place that's based on a real place. Tell us about a place called Ubec, and tell me about how that relates to your writing and you as a 9-year-old girl or a small girl hearing the stories that were given to you by
Yes.
your family, how that kind of blossomed and bloomed into what became, I think it was your first novel.
Okay, so to backtrack a little bit, so aside from reading comics and Nancy Drew and so on, one of my favorite activities as a child was listening to the radio soap operas. So we had an area where the cook and the servants, this is in the Philippines, would be working. We called it a dirty kitchen.
Right,
And
right.
I loved to hang out there in the afternoon after school because they would have the transistor radio blasting and they would be listening to their soap operas. Well, I loved it. I was a little girl and I would sit there on that rough hewn bench, legs swinging, and I would be listening to the love affairs and the out of wedlock pregnancies and all the dilemmas that were all very dramatic, in between the advertisement jingles. But I suppose even as a little child, I already understood the power of characters in conflict. I mean, I couldn't wait to find out if the doctor was going to kill the mother or the baby in her womb,
Mm.
or whatever the dilemma was, because this was just like ongoing. There were cliffhangers all the time. So I think that was another contribution to this love of story, the notion that fictional characters can have a life of their own. So that was that. And now going back to my place where I grew up, Cebu. Again, I must have been kind of nosy because I was always sort of observing the people in there, and they were interesting. I mean, there was a woman whom everybody said had horns, that she had horns. And so as a little girl, I would look, and she had little she had little poofs on her head. And so she's the one with horns. And so that was stuck in there. And as you can see, eventually she became a story.
Yes, yes.
There was a witch. There was a witch in town who walked around with a black umbrella in front of her face. And again, I mean, that was just the most fanciful thing. A child could come across a witch across the street. And
Right.
again, she found her way into the story. So there was a lot of stories, a lot of folklore, a lot of just there was in our backyard, there was a tree, a jackfruit tree, and everybody swore that at night a huge black giant would appear and would be sitting on top of some big branch smoking his cigar. He's kind of an archetypal creature in the Philippines, anta or capre, and so these little things were in the head. And when I started to write, I I would try to draw from the characters that I knew in Cebu, and I would do my best, but I would just get hung up because I don't know, I would just not be able to finish it. And finally, I was messing around and I inverted Cebu to Ubec, just reversed the letters and came out Ubec, and I used Ubec, and suddenly it was like I was free. I was free from having to tell the truth, from having to have the street in the exact place. I was free and I could make up stories. And so that's where Ubec came from. And at that point too, when I was starting to write, I was it's a long journey, but to truncate it, I kind of had to find my voice because, frankly, what was in my head were stories by Faulkner and Hemingway and all these Western writers, and my initial stories were very Eurocentric, and they were not me. And it took some rough critiquings in workshops for me to really own up to that. And so then I in a way, I kind of turned my head and deliberately looked at Ubek and what all was going on in there, and what was the history of Ubek, and what was the history of me, so to speak, growing up. What about my family? What about my grandmother? And on and on. And suddenly there's this wealth of material to mine. And eventually I loosened up and I went to other places, and I could write. I found I could write about anyone and anything, really. A dog, I could write about a dog. All I had to do was to be interested in them.
Yeah,
And I could do
and
that.
in the story, in the woman with horns, I guess it has that folklorish type
Yes,
element going for it, because apparently you have Augustine, or what is her name? Her name is
Agustina.
Augustina, whose mother apparently went to the river and encountered a
Yes,
spirit and consummated
yes.
something that became Augustina, and she became kind of like you were saying that in people in Ubek like to gossip. Everybody's talking, talking,
Oh,
talking.
yes.
Jaime, the doctor, is trying to tell Gerald, everybody talks here. So, there's gossip,
Yeah.
gossip, and gossip. But, there's chisme, gossip, there's story and memory. Um, now, your family was part of the guerrilla resistance during World War II, and I know that you were born after World War II,
Yes.
um, and I know that's a painful thing to talk about, but it is part of our history, and there's been a lot of literature that's been kind of focused on that. Um, can you talk about your novel When the Rainbow
When
Goddess
the rainbow
Wept?
goddess
Now,
wept.
now, apparently that wasn't the first title. That it was
Yes,
actually
correct.
Yvonne's song, or
Song of
Song of Yvonne,
Yvonne.
Song of Yvonne. Yeah.
Correct. So let me talk a little bit about where that novel came from. The first draft of that had nothing to do with the war. The first draft had to do with use the same characters, but they were set not in 1940s, but they were set in the 50s. It was my girlhood, my childhood. And so, in a way, the protagonist, Yvonne, in the novel was kind of like me, who had a best friend, Esperanza. And I did have a best friend, Esperanza. And so, for about 200 or 150 pages, I was writing about these two girls and their mothers and this town that was called Ubek. And but but there was no tension, no tension at all. However, eventually, at some point in the evolution of the novel, I looked at that draft and I discovered that the characters, the older characters, were constantly talking about the past. They were constantly talking about, do you remember when the Japanese soldier killed the doctora? Do you remember when they barged in, found a radio, and killed somebody? And this is true. I heard my parents talk about this, and that was right there in the draft. And it took seeing the novel Hope and Glory, which is a World War II novel in England, for a light bulb to light up above my head and go, oh my God, it wants to be a war novel, which is kind of frightening because you know the saying about write what you know. And since I was born after the war, I'm going, what do I know about the war? But I mean, the characters were demanding. If you're going to write about us, you're going to write about what was significant to us, what changed our lives, what was most important to us. That was the defining time of their lives. And so I just sort of started. I just, from the 1950s, I went back in time and I started a war. I began right when the war started. And then it flowed. It was like magic. It was just amazing. And these little girls were talking and everybody was talking, moving, and there was the the tension, and I used a lot of what I had heard as a little girl from my parents. It is fiction. I made things up, but my father was in the guerrilla movement. They were in Mindanao, and yeah, and I think it was really kind of important, um, to give to kind of look at what their lives could have been over there, because it was a fact that my mother had lost a child there, and it was a fact that they had to hide behind bushes, I think when she had a miscarriage, if I remember what they had told me, while a Japanese patrol walked by nearby. And these things I have written into the novel, fictionalized because I was not there, but piecing bits and pieces that I had heard, and doing research.
And
I
this
had
is
to I had to look at
written from the point of view of a
a,
child,
a
so
girl.
of a girl. So you have Yvonne and Esperanza.
Esperanza is not a significant. I mean, she's there, then she's not there. Yvonne is a storyteller. So
Okay.
we are really experiencing all this through Yvonne's eyes. At some point in the craft of it, in the writing, I tried to let Esperanza tell the story, and she's a high-strung kid,
I
and
think
she
you had
was not a
mentioned you had mentioned in an interview that she was katag katag,
yeah, katak
right?
katak, just
Yeah, yeah,
and she couldn't. She was unreliable. She was not a good storyteller. But
yeah,
Yvonne was pretty composed and very observant,
yeah.
and good storyteller.
I want to ask you. There's a novel that's coming out in the next week or so. It's called Imelda's Secret by
Ah,
Lisa Guino, and that's about the comfort women during World War II in the Philippines. And research had to be done on that, because the survivors of that, they're shrinking in numbers.
yes,
Talk about your process of doing research for for that, because of course, that came. You were born after World War II, so
yes,
that takes some doing to be able to create that and maintain the
yeah.
integrity of the story. How did you do that?
What led the story were the characters.
Mm,
And I knew enough from the history lessons and from what I had read of what the basics were of what happened. This happened at this time, this happened at that, and so on and so forth. Um, so as I would write it, I mean, so there you are, you already have a kind of a scaffolding. It's going to begin at this time, it's going to end at this time. But if I came across some issues like the Bataan Death March
right.
and I wanted details, I look it up. So I'll go, well, when did it start and what happened here and how many thousand people, whatever it was, and so on and so forth. And it wasn't like I copied it. I just put it into my head, because a novel really isn't history. It's really about the people going through that, surviving that time. And so it had to have enough information in there to make it realistic. Um, Sometimes I come across new information now about what happened in Cebu at that time, and I go, oh, too bad I didn't know that. I could have written it in. But yeah. And so
Was
curiously, what was interesting to me is that poli-sci and history teachers were using that book. So there was enough whatever there it was convincing enough. But it's really about the characters and how they dealt with this horrific event in the Philippines.
Yeah, you mentioned, when you were starting your life in writing, that you were writing from, I guess, trying to write in the way that more white writers were writing, because I mean, Oscar Peñaranda told me the same thing. It was, Hemingway, and it was, all these different folks, and then he realized one day that, hey, we have our stories to tell. How, what was what was the response back home, particularly in Cebu, to
Oh,
that first novel? I mean, I know you said that it was taught in school, but uh, I mean, if you had relatives that were still living, or family members, what was their response to the book?
uh, so the first version of it, Song of Yvonne, came out in 1993. I forget now exactly what date, that year, 93, I believe, or 91, 1991, I believe. My mother was alive and my brother was alive, and they were all, it's so well received, Tony. You cannot imagine the number of, even now, these PhD students or masteral students who contact me because it's part of their papers. And just not too long ago, a Japanese student I believe is in Texas, uh, pursuing his PhD, also has integrated When the Rainbow Goddess is part of his PhD dissertation. So I have no complaints about the reception of that novel and my works, really, from Filipinos and Philams. They have done their part in supporting the work and honoring what went into it. So, and I'm grateful to them. I mean,
You,
let me tell you, I mean, I think I might have mentioned to you, take the little story of Woman with Horns.
yeah.
Go to YouTube and research it, and you are going to find a whole bunch of student work where they're doing little theatrical skits
Hmm.
on Woman with Horns. And
Yeah.
ditto with Flip Gothic, another story of mine also used in schools. So I mean, so this is used in classrooms and so on. Now, the When the Rainbow Goddess Wept, because it was published in the U.S. In fact, a lot of them had difficulty finding it there, and they had Song of Yvonne. So it was a little bit of a challenge for some of these academics who wanted to write about it, but they would find it. They could find it.
So you wanted to be, I guess, initially you had an interest in film, but it was a matter of too many cooks in the kitchen. Do you think that the When the Rainbow Goddess Wept could be adapted to a film? Do you think that it would do well as a film?
I think it would do well as a film. And that was actually optioned, but here in Santa Monica, some Weinstein, they optioned it and they hung on to it for I don't know how long, and then that passed. They had not made it. And I know in the Philippines too, it was like they were kind of looking at it a little, but it has not happened. But I think that it is quite visual, and I think, but so I don't know, who knows?
Well, I know
If
that
somebody will.
there's some cases where the movie gets adapted. I mean, the a novel gets adapted into a movie, and the book is actually better than. I mean, as great as the Godfather saga was, in
Yeah.
many ways, that book was even better than the movie because they left a lot of
Oh,
stuff out of the movie that was in the book. Um, Now that was published. Your novel was published. Your first novel was published by uh, in the States here. I guess Michigan. Was it the University?
first it was Dutton Penguin.
Oh,
It was a big
Dutton Penguin. Okay, yeah.
Dutton Penguin did it, and then if you recall, at some point they had all kinds of mergers.
Hmm.
And so there was, so among our publishing houses, they kind of whittled down and they just had a few owners, and they were remaindering a whole bunch of titles. So I am proud to say that When the Rainbow Goddess Wept was remaindered by Dutton Penguin along with Van Gogh's letters.
Oh, okay.
Both are both the titles were remaindered.
Right.
And very fortunately, the University of Michigan Press picked it up within the year. And how that came about was that there was a professor who was using it in his classroom, and he tried to get copies and was just in shock when he learned it was remaindered. And he said, that cannot be. And so he contacted me. I don't know how he found me. And he connected me directly to the editor of the University of Michigan Press. And so that's how that came about.
So,
So,
so they published the book here in the U.S.
oh, yes. So first was the Dutton Penguin in hardback and paperback. And then, unfortunately, that was remaindered. University of Michigan immediately picked it up.
So when
And
you say
so,
remainder, that means that it was no
yeah, they
longer in
discontinued
circulation.
it.
Okay,
Right, correct.
yeah.
They discontinued it. It
So
was a
Michigan,
result of,
so Michigan resurrected it. I mean, it was a professor
yes,
that
yes,
which
yes.
which provides a nice segue into our next our next topic. I became kind of familiar with you through your work on two anthologies, Growing Up Filipino Volumes 1 and 2, and
Yes,
How Michigan kind of um, applies to this is that, you saw that there was a need for Filipinos to have kind of young adult type stories. We now know that we have more of an offering of that with, Randy Ribeye, for instance, who's from Michigan.
sure, sure.
The saint, was it Patron Saints of Nothing, that's garnered a lot
Yes.
of attention. But talk about those two volumes, because when those came out, it was like a big splash. I mean, people said, wow, you know this is great. What prompted you to do volume 1, and then what prompted you to take it further?
Actually, I have to give credit to Gwen Galvez in the Philippines. He was the marketing director at Alvin at Anvil Publishing House, which was my publisher there. Because one day we were just kind of chatting. I was editing a bunch of books and getting them published by them. And so we had finished a project, and she kind of went, Cecilia, we really need young adult books, blah 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 blah. And I said, oh, really? Oh, well, that would be easy. I could see it in my head already, what could happen. And so I said, all right, I'll work on it. And well, to Anvil's disgrace, they had some changes in their office or whatever. They backed out on me. And so they left me with a complete manuscript with all those stories, all those permissions, everything.
Mm,
And at that point, I had created my publishing house, PAL, which at that time was, selling books, small time. But I went, well, I'm not going to let this go to waste. So I went, I can do this. And so that was my first, I had done a little bit of publishing for a women's group. So I did it. And Growing Up Filipino, Stories for Young Adults, I'll have you know, Tony, that just not too long ago, it was mentioned in a National Geographic. It was in their summer
right,
reading list.
right.
And since I am now know what the book sales are and so on, I could see it go boom. So it has not died. It has not died. And that book has been around for a long time.
And there's
So I am,
lovely stories in
it's
that collection.
wonderful,
Very lovely.
wonderful.
Which leads to another segue. In volume 1, there was a story by Joel B. Tan, or Joel
Yes,
B. Tan, called San Francisco with a P, which brings me to San Francisco. Okay, we have Archipelago Books, and we also have something called the Filipino American International Book Festival, which
yes,
happens every I
two
guess every 2
years.
years or 3 years, in the month of October, which is Filipino American History Month. And you've been kind of at the helm of something called Hot Off the Press, which you take all of these different authors that have had new books. Uh, you know, uh, Talk about that. Was it your idea to have that? And how much work goes into that, and what kind of satisfaction do you get
Yes.
from putting that together?
I have to own up that that idea came about from my being a teacher over at the writers program at UCLA Extension, because for the longest time, the director there, Linda Venus, used to host reading once a year for their teachers who had new books. And they would do short readings like that. And that was it. It was like a 2-hour program of the teachers sharing short excerpts of their work. And it was it was a wonderful event. And so when the Philippine American Festival began, I mentioned to Edwin, I want to do this. And so I think it was Edwin in charge, I forget now. And it was like, sure. And it was Veronica Montes and I who worked together. And Veronica's a hard worker. But so it was basically asking authors to do, as you know, I mean, there's an invitation, and you only have so many minutes, and so on and so forth. Now, Edwin Lozada has actually, I think what happens is he gets all these authors coming to him. And so to cut the story, he's the one who's sort of handling who does poetry and who does, and so forth, and scheduling and so on, which is fine. And so he says, well, okay. And so we're working together, Cecilia, for Saturday, these, what do you think of these authors kind of thing, and this kind of thing. And then the rest of it, I'm contacting the authors and laying guidelines and stuff. And I am very strict. I think for a Filipino American, I'm probably somewhat anal, and I'm not sure how happy people are, because I will actually, if they go over 8 minutes or 7 minutes, I will really kind of, it's not fair. If you got a 2-hour program and people are sucking up 15 minutes of time, you can't have that, as you know, because you're a poet and you do readings.
Yeah.
So, but the programs are wonderful.
I mean, the last time out, it was really wonderful. I mean,
they're very nice.
You had Grace Toulousan, you had Betty Ann Carino
Yes.
cookbook. Elmer Omar really kind of had me on the floor. I mean, that guy was cracking me up. And then you had EJR David, is that his last name? David from Alaska, talking about his half Filipino, half Tlingit, I guess, half Indian or native children, just on that whole thing. And it was really wonderful. I think Randy was there, everybody.
Yes. Now, to clarify, it's Edwin really who's bringing in those authors, because they're the ones who contact him to participate in the festival. Yeah. So he's the one who knows them. Now, if there are people that so I'm telling him, Edwin, don't forget Brian, whoever, and making sure that, so it's something like that. But they're very nice. I mean, if they were all recorded, they would be quite a wonderful thing to see, each one, because there's something magical that happens when you tell people they only have 7 or 8 minutes. They pick the best 8 minutes, and they do a fine performance. They don't waste their time, and they just go bing. And when you string that together, wonderful.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about, let me get my computer here. And this is something that I found online, which I think is very wonderful. The U.S. edition of Fiction by Filipinos in America has been released or will be released. The U.S. edition. Oh, there you go. So, it has short fiction by you, Carlos Bulason, Luis Cabelquinto, Virginia Sereno, Bert Florentino, Michelle Cruz Skinner, Bienvenido Santos, Oscar Peña, just everybody, Manuel Olimpo, the late NVM Gonzalez, Linda Ty Casper, Marianne Villanueva, who I really love. I think Marianne is something else.
Marianne.
I really like Marianne. She's like an auntie, But you know what? If you could talk a little bit about that book, there is one particular story that I think is probably the most beautiful short story I've ever written. If anybody asks me what's the best short story I've ever read, bar none. Can you talk about your relationship with Bienvenido Santos? He was just such a wonderful writer, and it really comes through in his writing. Can you talk about him?
I met Ben in Los Angeles when he was an established Filipino American writer, and I was just starting to come out with my short stories. And it is because of Ben that I found a publisher in the Philippines. It was Ben who recommended me to Gloria Rodriguez. And the minute Ben said that, there was just no quibbling. Mrs. Rodriguez was going to publish Woman with Horns and Other Stories. So Ben,
Which is this one right
yes,
here, right?
Bienvenido. Yes, that was the first collection.
Of
This is
short
the first
stories.
book.
And when did this one
Correct.
come out? What year?
1988 or 87.
I think that's your first collection, correct?
That is my first
I think
collection.
I
I had
was
a
doing a little
dozen.
research. I think it was 1987. Yeah,
Correct.
yeah.
So that came about because of Ben's well, it wasn't really intervention, but he just said, "Oh, Cecilia, why don't you approach Gloria Rodriguez, who was his publisher as well in the Philippines?" But I mentioned that because Ben was he was a gentleman. He was very cariñoso. He was very kind, and he was very generous. He would write me letters. I mean, at that time we wrote letters, and very supportive, and just a sterling person, you know. I I knew some of the writers of his generation, just a few older than me, Linda Moore, Lena Moore in Cebu, and some others who knew him. And so there was like a little group of writers there who were just more Florentino too, who were a few years ahead, who had already published and so on. And I had found them to be very supportive. So that was very nice. So that was Ben. And whenever he was in town, we would see him. Linda Nietas, bless her, always had some kind of soiree in her bookshop.
Right, right.
Yeah, and she would push them, you know, in their books and so on.
Shout out to Linda if you're watching this.
Yes,
Much
Linda,
much love to you and all your work
Philippine
that you do.
expressions.
Yeah.
God, she has a great selection of Filipino and Filipino American books, the best, even the hard to find books.
I mean, it sounds like Ben with Bienvenido Santos was very forthcoming and very generous. Can you talk about the importance as a writer of being generous, in particular to younger writers that are coming up?
You know, there are very few of us, Tony. I mean, even though it seems there are now more Filipino American authors in balance, there are very few of us. It's like a little exclusive club. And I think that it is better for all of us to help one another rather than to do the typical crab thing, which I have to say still exists, you know, but I find that the professional writers are quite supportive and generous. I mean, you see them in our little group, internet group. How Barbara BJ is very, very generous. A lot of other people. Veronica Montes is a very wonderful, warm, supportive person. Very Marianne Villanueva, you know,
Right.
so Oscar Peñaranda. So I mean, it's almost like a little club, you know, and even extending to the Philippines too.
You know, I had
I
the opportunity a few years ago at the Filipino Book Festival. I'd never met Jimmy Abad. He's a great guy. I mean, Jimmy was cool, and then also Luis Francia was cool too. I met him a couple of times,
yeah,
but Luis was cool. You know, I mean, we got in a little conversation. I was able to, when I went to the Philippines a few years ago, I did a presentation for his class at UP, which
oh,
which
cool.
turned out really nice. You know, did you want to read an excerpt from any of your stories?
Oh, I'm not sure really how prepared I am, Tony. Do you have any preference? I
Um,
mean,
actually, there was there was actually a story in the Acapulco at sunset. Do you have that on hand?
yes, I do actually.
Yeah, there's a San Francisco story because you know I'm from Frisco, and
Oh,
we kind of have this identity. We kind of, you know, some of us refer to ourselves as Frisco Pinos, and and I do likewise. There's a story about a woman and her husband, and the husband's
Butterscotch
whining about the
marble.
damn ice cream, and it hits home because I used to go to Swenson's in North Beach, and they had another one on Hyde
Yes,
Street near the cable
yes,
car.
probably the same one,
Yeah,
the very same one. So about a couple pages, or how
yeah,
do you feel?
yeah. If you want to do a
I just,
page, that's fine. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
just
I
whatever
mean,
you're
I'll just
comfortable.
take it up from the top. It's
Okay,
butterscotch marble ice cream.
okay.
And Friday night, Mark wanted to go to Swenson's. I need butterscotch marble ice cream, he announced. I was 8 months pregnant and wanted to stay home. The night before, I hardly slept. I was so big that finding a comfortable position in bed was impossible. Changing position was a major production. Getting out of bed was a task. It was depressing. Everything was depressing. Like the old woman hanging clothes from a line that stretched from one end of the building to the other. I had seen her earlier that day after I finished scrubbing the thrift store bought bassinet with Clorox. The apartment reeked, so I opened the living room window. I spotted her then. She must have been 60, with chin-length white hair whipping around her face. She was leaning out a window, her kitchen window, I guess, and she had some clothespins dangling from her mouth. The way she stooped, or maybe it was her scraggly hair, gave her a defeated look. She hung her laundry, then pulled the line towards her, hung some more and pulled. The entire line rotated slowly, and the clothes swayed back and forth rhythmically. Underwear, nightgowns, pants, shirts, sheets, and towels wavered in the air. And for some reason, they all looked gray. The whole scene looked bleak. As I watched her, I had a feeling that years from now, I would be doing exactly the same thing, hanging laundry from my fifth floor apartment in a mission district of San Francisco. Do you want me to end it there?
Yeah, I mean, it connected with me because I lived in the Mission. I went to Mission High School for a couple of years, and the story was like foreshadowing. It was like you're seeing this, and then at the end you see the reflection of. But it was kind of funny too because he was very I think it was the husband that was very insistent on the ice cream, and knowing Swenson's, knowing the good ice cream that they have, I can imagine just going on a whole excursion to try to get the ice cream. But then there was a twist to it. The ice cream wasn't exactly for the person that they would have thought. I
Yes.
mean, it was kind of
So, well, first they go to the Swenson's up on the hill,
on Hyde
and
Street.
it's
Yeah,
closed.
yeah,
So
yeah,
then they take the cable car and they go down,
yeah.
and the van is closing. But
Hmm.
then he sees the pregnant young woman and he says, "You need it bad," and she says yes, she's lying. But so then he dishes out ice cream for free for them. It is one of my favorite stories, and it's somewhat autobiographical, I suppose. We lived in a mission district across the Levi Strauss.
Hmm.
Uh, my husband was he was attending Hastings Law School.
Hastings. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is close to my heart.
Is
Um,
is the artwork on the cover? Is that something that you did? Was that one of your sketches?
oh, this one, yes, indeed. I am
Yeah.
very proud of this. I did this, and it's a drawing I did of a place in Mexico that we visit now and then in San Miguel Allende. It's the rooftop. Uh, so, I mean, I don't know, it wraps around. But so I discovered, so what happened was these books were published in the Philippines, including this. And some of them are now out of print or difficult to find. And all the rights have reverted to me. And so I thought, well, I'm going to do US editions of them because people are still looking for them and they were never really easily accessible here in the US. Not that everybody's going to flock and buy them, but nonetheless, at least librarians or whoever is interested. can now access them.
So we
So
have
I,
the U.S. edition of Woman with Horns and Other Stories,
correct,
and this is the U.S. edition, Philippine American Literary House, PALH, and also Acapulco at Sunset and Other Stories, another wonderful collection of
correct,
short stories, and also fiction by Filipinos in America. Many of these
correct.
authors are really just wonderful and have just very very wonderful work. I want to ask you finally, because we're going to have to close in about 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Peter Bacho had a piece. Actually, it was somebody that had interviewed him or spoken to him in Positively Filipino a couple of years ago,
Yes.
and he's a college professor. I know he had a stroke, and I guess he'd
Oh,
been recovering.
I
I think. Well,
didn't
don't
know
quote me.
that,
I think he
Tony.
did have a stroke a
Okay, I'm
year or so
sorry.
a year or so ago. But in the piece, he he was talking about how uh, he felt that Filipino Americans or Filipinos don't really read that much, and he kind of felt that he was kind of hitting kind of a brick wall.
It's
I don't know if
true.
you got it. I don't know if you had a chance to read that piece, but he was being interviewed by one of the writers, and he was talking about how I guess popular culture, internet, TV, um, talent shows on television, and 10,000 other things have taken the attention away from the writing. Can you talk about, your feelings about that or your take on it?
This is true. I had not read his interview, but I had always understood from get-go that Filipinos, and I think it stands to Filipino Americans, are not readers. I had discussed this with friends who are PhDs in folklore and anthropology, and we more or less decided it's because the culture is really very oral. I mean, we're talking about the stories of the enchanted giant and the witches and all of this. And so it's storytelling. We are good at storytelling. And you might call it chismes, but that's storytelling. And that is
Yeah.
what we want to do. And so, no, I don't think we are readers, really. And this is a downfall to us writers because then not enough people buy our books. And when that happens, we have a heck of a time finding a publisher. I got published by Dutton Penguin, and it was picked up by University of Michigan Press. And that's pretty much it in terms of, oh, and then a Plainview Press. But we do not sell books. And even though I've had agents, it's just pretty much, I think the undertone of it is that this is not commercial. This is not going to sell enough. And I know that the others, and you just have to look around our writer friends, the ones whose books have been remaindered, and they're now having difficulty getting their second book published, that's because of that. That's because of the fact that their first book didn't make enough so that the publisher would invest in them again.
Do you
So it's
see
very,
this? Well, do you see this changing a little bit with ebooks and books that are kind of like audiobooks? I think those are on the rise. Um,
Tony, I think that we may improve a little bit, but it's not going to be to a level that's going to be really kind of substantial. I mean, I hate to be kind of negative. I have seen my Japanese American friend Naomi Hirahara, and I've seen her do readings in Japanese Town here in Los Angeles. The whole community shows up, little old ladies, and I'm not even sure really how if they read in English because they're still really, uh, but they buy stacks of her books, and I think they understand the politics behind it. I think they understand that if they're buying Naomi's books, then they've got one of theirs who's going to be in the bestseller list. And so I think there's an innate understanding there that it's a political thing. We've got one of our own in there with a voice. And we don't do that. I mean, we will go to shows and dances and whatever, but we don't have that innate thing of, hey, we better buy. Now, having said that, I think it's better because obviously Randy Rebai and the woman also does young adult.
Erin
And I'm
Entrada Kelly, I think her name is Erin
correct,
Entrada
correct.
Kelly. Right?
And I'm reading a book by Laurel Fontoso, The Heart Underwater. She's also Phil Am. So now there's a whole bunch of younger generation Phil Am writers that are finding publishers. So obviously things have improved,
Yeah.
but I
And I
think we
think the
need,
more people that, that hear, our stories and our truth, when they engage in it, it really gets them to start thinking and think, wow, it gets them looking at things in a different way. And I think they get more, there's more of an attraction. But I guess we just have to keep working at it, and using the
well,
internet as much as we can, using social media and the internet to kind of promote
yes, yes.
each
And
other and
thank you,
stuff.
because you're doing your part. Thank
Yeah,
you very much.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
this is good, and all the other things that you do are just remarkable. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you. I appreciate it. And these two books are really, really wonderful. And I think it's a testament to memory, that we don't that we don't forget our stories. Coming from a background in the Philippines, and that richness, and being able to write about my hometown, Swenson's, and then being a bridge to another generation, with the growing up Filipino books. Those are going to last. I mean, because got lot of young folks that don't know that these exist, and when they see it, they're like, wow, look at that. I mean, you had some wonderful stories. Is there the possibility of a volume 3 at some of a
You,
volume 3 at some point?
Tony, somebody just asked me about that. One of the writers in there, and I said there's no plan. But you're the second one who's asked, so I don't know. I might have to think about it.
Yeah,
Um,
because with some of the writers that are coming up, some of the ones that are emerging, I can imagine that
yes,
there's some really good
yes.
stuff. So we're going to have to wrap up, Cecilia. Again, Cecilia Manguerra Brainard, the author of Acapulco at Sunset and Other Stories, some wonderful short stories, and also Woman with Horns and Other Stories. U.S. editions, PALH, Philippine American Literary House. Uh, when the Rainbow Goddess Wept, her first novel, as well as Magdalena and Newspaper Widow. Can you leave us with where people can find you on the internet? And if they want to buy your books,
Okay.
please tell us where.
Yeah, it's very easy. I mean, you go to Amazon. So these books are available there. And if you want to go out of your way, please support Philippine Expressions and Archipelago. I'm not sure if they have copies, but they can always get them to resell. And what was the other part of your question, Tony?
Yeah, just where they can find you on the internet as well. If they, if you have a
Oh,
website. Yeah.
also very easy, ceciliabrainard.com. So I have an official website. You can find me in Facebook and, Instagram and that kind of thing. But ceciliabrainard.com has information about me, books, and a blog in there.
So Cecilia
So
Brainard, that's Brainard. I think your name is already in
correct.
kind of little small letters. I wish we could go on for another hour, but
I know,
I do have the economy Zoom plan. So um,
but thank you, Tony. I appreciate the interview. I appreciate the support through the years,
no
and
problem, no problem.
look forward to seeing you at the next festival.
Oh, for sure. And hopefully, we'll get over this COVID thing, and, give my best to your husband, and,
Oh, yes.
and hopefully we can have a chapter or a volume 3 of Growing Up
Growing
Filipino.
up Filipino. I'm going to seriously think about that now because you're the second person. I will. Thank you for nudging me.
All right. Thank you so
Take
much. I
care.
appreciate it. Bye
Okay,
now.
God bless you. Take care.
All right.